Why is Michael Faraday often called the genius without degrees who lit up the world? This question has echoed through the halls of science for over a century. It is a question that continues to fascinate historians, scientists, students, and dreamers alike. In an age when great scientific minds were often molded by universities, aristocratic circles, and scholarly traditions, Michael Faraday stood as a contradiction. He was no professor, no man of higher learning adorned with diplomas or honorary academic robes. He came from poverty, worked as a bookbinder's apprentice, and educated himself by reading the books he stitched together. He never mastered advanced mathematics, he never held a university degree, and yet his discoveries transformed the modern world. Faraday gave humanity the very foundation of the electrical age. His experimental genius revealed the mysteries of electromagnetism, inspired the dynamo, and led directly to the technologies that now power our homes, our industries, and our cities. His insights into chemistry helped define the field with clarity and order. His imagination reshaped how scientists understood the invisible forces of nature. And perhaps most importantly, his life became proof that genius is not confined by privilege or certificates. It can emerge from humble origins, fueled by curiosity, perseverance, and faith. But how did this happen? How did a poor boy from Newington Butts with little formal education rise to become one of the most influential scientists in history? What shaped his mind, his spirit, and his unshakable dedication to discovery? Why did the world look at him, a man of modest means, and see the very embodiment of scientific brilliance? This story, Michael Faraday's story, is not only about science. It is about resilience. It is about the power of self-education. It is about the way one human being, guided by curiosity and integrity, can change the destiny of mankind. And as we embark on this journey, we will uncover the threads of his life, his childhood of hardship, his unlikely entrance into the world of science, his breakthroughs that electrified the 19th century, and the enduring legacy that still illuminates the 21st. Imagine standing in Victorian England in the great lecture hall of the Royal Institution. The audience is filled with scholars, aristocrats, and curious citizens, all eager for knowledge. On stage stands a man in simple attire, not a nobleman, not a university professor, not a polished orator of Oxford or Cambridge, but a quiet, humble figure with a clear voice and sparkling eyes. This is Michael Faraday. He begins his demonstration. Coils of wire, magnets, and sparks. Within moments, the room is alight with the wonder of electricity, invisible forces dancing before the eyes of the audience. Gasps of awe ripple through the hall. Those who witnessed Faraday's lectures often left transformed. They were not merely learning about science, they were experiencing it. They were seeing with their own eyes that nature's hidden powers could be harnessed, understood, and explained. And behind every experiment was the mind of a man who had once bound books in a dusty shop, a man who had found knowledge, not in classrooms, but in pages borrowed from the shelves he worked upon. The world soon came to recognize Faraday as something unique, a genius untamed by convention, a thinker who relied not on mathematical abstractions, but on intuition, careful observation, and boundless creativity. Some called him the experimenter's experimenter. Others, like Albert Einstein, would later keep his portrait on their wall, a silent acknowledgement that Faraday's visions made modern physics possible. And yet, the paradox remains. Faraday never sought honors, never craved wealth, never even considered himself an intellectual giant. He saw himself as a servant of truth, guided by humility and by his faith. His genius was not in the pursuit of personal glory, but in the relentless exploration of nature's mysteries. The story of Michael Faraday is more than history. It is a mirror for our times. In a world obsessed with credentials, degrees, and institutional recognition, Faraday's life reminds us that brilliance can arise outside the traditional paths. He demonstrates that curiosity, discipline, and imagination are more powerful than the walls of any university. His discoveries laid the groundwork for electricity, magnetism, and chemistry, the very sciences that fuel our modern technology. But his example laid the groundwork for something deeper, the belief that anyone, regardless of background, can aspire to greatness through knowledge. If we hold a smartphone today, if we turn on a light, if we hear the hum of a generator, we are hearing echoes of Michael Faraday's laboratory. If we study electromagnetism, if we trace the lineage of physics through James Clerk Maxwell to Albert Einstein, we are following paths that Faraday first walked. And if we dare to believe that one person, from the humblest beginnings, can change the world, we are living proof of Faraday's enduring gift. Michael Faraday's story begins not in the halls of science, but in the modest streets of Newington Butts, a district on the southern edge of London. He was born on the 22nd of September, 1791, into a family that had little to offer the world except its resilience. His father, James Faraday, was a blacksmith from Yorkshire, a man of strong arms but fragile health. His mother, Margaret Haswell, was a woman of quiet strength, whose devotion and sacrifice kept the family afloat through poverty and hardship. England in 1791 was a land of contrasts. The French Revolution rumbled across the Channel, sparking fears of upheaval among Britain's rulers. London was a city of elegance and filth. Grandeur and squalor mansions of the wealthy stood not far from the crowded alleys of the poor. It was into this latter world that Michael was born, the third of 4 surviving children. The Faraday household was cramped and simple. There was little money, less comfort, and no promise of education beyond the most basic. Michael grew up without the privileges that might have steered him naturally toward science. And yet, it was in these humble beginnings that the seeds of genius were sown. James Faraday, Michael's father, worked as a blacksmith in Newington Butts. The work was hard, the pay meager, and his health poor. Frequent illness left him unable to provide consistently for the family. The children knew the uncertainty of meals, the constant worry of rent, the fragile line between survival and destitution. But James, despite his frailty, carried dignity in his craft. The sound of hammer against anvil, the glow of molten metal, the transformation of raw iron into tools and fittings, these were the sights and sounds of Michael's childhood. Though he would not follow his father into the forge, the image of transformation, the hidden power in common materials, may have left its mark on the boy's imagination. His mother, Margaret, carried the heavier burden. She managed the household with thrift and love, stretching scarce resources to feed and clothe her children. She was known for her gentleness and her devotion to her children's moral upbringing. In later years, Michael would remember her fondly as the anchor of his life. If his father gave him resilience, his mother gave him faith and humility. Formal schooling was beyond the reach of the Faraday family. Michael received only the most rudimentary instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic at a local school. Beyond that, education was a luxury they could not afford. In another family, at another time, this might have condemned a child to ignorance. But Michael possessed a restless curiosity. He wanted to know more, to see more, to understand more. Lacking teachers, he turned to the world itself. He watched, listened, and asked questions. He examined objects, tinkered with toys, observed the patterns of nature. Later, as an apprentice bookbinder, he would compensate for his lack of schooling by devouring the volumes he handled. But even as a boy, his mind was hungry. He had little instruction, but much imagination. He had no textbooks, but an abundance of questions. Poverty was not an abstraction in Faraday's life. It was a daily reality. Shoes were worn until they could no longer be patched. Meals were plain and sometimes scarce. Work was necessary as soon as one was able. Leisure was rare, and luxury unheard of. And yet poverty, also forged resilience. Michael learned to endure hardship without complaint. He learned the value of persistence, the dignity of labor, the importance of thrift. He grew up understanding that nothing would be given freely, that everything must be earned. These lessons would serve him well. In the laboratory, he would be tireless, methodical, unwilling to give up after failure. In life, he would be modest, unpretentious, never lured by wealth or status. The hardships of childhood became the virtues of adulthood. From these early years, Faraday's defining traits emerged: humility, perseverance, faith. He did not believe himself superior to others. He saw himself as a servant of truth. He did not expect success to come easily. He was prepared to labor endlessly. He did not lose hope in adversity. He trusted in providence and in the value of honesty and diligence. It is tempting to imagine that Faraday's genius was innate, a gift bestowed at birth. But genius alone does not explain his life. Many are gifted, few persevere. What made Faraday extraordinary was not only the spark of talent, but the character that fanned it into flame. That character was forged in poverty, in hardship, in the love of his mother and the struggles of his father. Growing up in London, Faraday was surrounded by both wonder and misery. The city was a place of endless sights and sounds, markets bustling with trade, carriages rattling over cobblestones, the Thames flowing with ships and commerce, but it was also a city of poverty, disease, and overcrowding. Michael saw both faces of London. He saw wealth he could never imagine, and poverty he knew too well. He saw opportunity and limitation side by side. The city taught him that the world was vast, complex, and filled with mystery. It also taught him that one's place in it was not fixed, that change was possible. Perhaps it was this environment that fueled his hunger for knowledge. In a world of contrasts, he longed to understand the forces that underlay both nature and society. The Faradays were members of the Sandemanian Church, a small Christian sect. The Sandemanians valued simplicity, humility, and strict adherence to Scripture. They rejected luxury, emphasized community, and prized moral integrity above all. This faith shaped young Michael profoundly. It taught him humility, honesty, and service. It gave him a sense of belonging and moral direction. Later in life, his faith would be both a refuge and a compass, guiding his decisions and sustaining him through hardship. In the scientific world, some saw his religion as peculiar, even limiting. But for Faraday, it was never an obstacle. It was a foundation. He saw no conflict between science and faith. To him, both were expressions of truth. Though poor and undereducated, Faraday was not without imagination. Like many children, he played with simple objects, sticks, stones, scraps. But unlike many, he saw in them mysteries to be unraveled. How did things move? Why did they change? What forces lay hidden in the ordinary? Later, as an experimenter, he would retain this childlike wonder. He would look at candles, magnets, coils of wire not as mundane objects, but as gateways to discovery. His scientific vision was rooted in the imagination of a boy who had nothing but curiosity. By the age of 13, Michael was ready for work. The family needed income, and his schooling, such as it was, had reached its end. He found employment as an errand boy for George Rebow, a local bookseller and bookbinder. It was a modest job delivering newspapers, running errands, sweeping floors, but it would soon change his life. In Rebow's shop, surrounded by books, Michael discovered a world of knowledge. Here, for the first time, he had access to the great minds of history. He began to read, and once he began, he never stopped. It was in this bookshop that the poor boy of Newington Butts would begin the journey to becoming the genius of the Royal Institution. In 1805, at the age of 14, Michael Faraday was formally apprenticed to George Rebow, the London bookbinder for whom he had already worked as an errand boy. For most boys, such an apprenticeship meant a lifetime of trade, years of learning to cut, stitch, glue, and press books, and then decades of labor in a craft that, though respectable, offered little hope of escape from poverty. But for Faraday, the bookbinder's shop was more than a workplace. It was a school of the mind. Surrounded by volumes of philosophy, science, history, and literature, he entered a world of ideas far grander than his humble station. While binding books, he read them. While sewing pages together, he absorbed their content. Each volume became a teacher, each author a guide. It was here that he first encountered the great scientific minds whose works would shape his destiny. Among the books Faraday read during his apprenticeship, none had greater influence than Jane Marcet's Conversations on Chemistry. Written in clear, accessible language, Marcet's book explained the fundamentals of chemistry through dialogues between a teacher and her students. For Faraday, who had little formal education, it was a revelation. Here was science, stripped of jargon, made comprehensible. He copied passages, drew diagrams, and even repeated simple experiments described in the book using improvised equipment at home. Marcet's work transformed his curiosity into structured knowledge. Later in life, Faraday would acknowledge his debt to her, calling her book the spark that ignited his career. Another formative influence was Isaac Watts's Improvement of the Mind. This book focused less on science and more on intellectual development, taught young Michael the habits of thought, how to reason, how to discipline the mind, how to pursue knowledge with diligence and integrity. It impressed upon him that self-education was possible and noble. Add to these the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which exposed him to a vast range of topics, from natural philosophy to mechanics. Though his education was piecemeal, it was rich, and most importantly, it was his own. He was not forced into learning. He chose it, devoured it, lived it. Faraday was not content merely to read. He wanted to see for himself. Inspired by the books he read, he began conducting simple experiments at home. Using bottles, wires, and scraps of material, he recreated the demonstrations described in Marcet's Conversations on Chemistry. One story tells of him rubbing a balloon to produce static electricity, fascinated by the way small bits of paper leapt toward it. In another, he attempted chemical reactions with whatever household materials he could find. His family, though poor, tolerated his experiments, though they may have raised eyebrows at the strange odors and small explosions. These early efforts revealed something essential about Faraday. He was not just a reader, but a doer. He believed knowledge must be tested, truth must be seen with the eyes and felt with the hands. This experimental instinct would define his career. The apprenticeship lasted 7 years, during which Faraday mastered the craft of bookbinding, but alongside it, he mastered the craft of self-education. Every spare moment he read, every new idea he tested, every question he pursued. His notebooks from this period show the precision and diligence that would mark his scientific career. He copied passages carefully, summarized arguments, sketched diagrams. He was not a passive reader, but an active learner, transforming what he read into his own understanding. This discipline of note-taking would remain with him throughout life. His scientific notebooks, 19 volumes in all, remain treasures of history, filled with careful records of experiments, insights, and reflections. The habit began in the bookbinder's shop. The bookshop brought Faraday into contact with a variety of customers: gentlemen, scholars, clergymen, and curious amateurs. Though he was shy, he listened closely to their conversations, absorbing fragments of knowledge and glimpses of the world beyond his reach. One customer in particular would play a pivotal role: William Dance, a member of the Royal Institution. Dance, noticing the boy's curiosity, took an interest in him. In 1812, he gave Faraday tickets to attend the public lectures of Sir Humphry Davy, one of the most celebrated scientists of the age. This act of kindness would change Faraday's life forever. But before we arrive at that fateful encounter, we must understand why it mattered so deeply. Because Faraday had prepared himself through years of hunger for knowledge, years of reading, years of training his mind in the bookbinder's shop. Without this preparation, the lectures might have been forgotten entertainment. With it, they became destiny. By the end of his apprenticeship, Faraday knew he did not want to spend his life binding books. Respectable as the trade was, it felt to him a cage. His heart yearned for discovery, for the thrill of unraveling nature's mysteries. And yet, aspiration was dangerous for a poor boy in London. To dream of science was to dream beyond his station. The Royal Institution, where Davy lectured, was a temple of knowledge reserved for the elite. For Faraday to aspire to that world was almost absurd, but he dared. He had read too much, learned too much, felt too much wonder to settle for less. He resolved to seize any opportunity, however small, to enter the world of science. The tickets given by William Dance brought Faraday into the lecture hall of the Royal Institution in Albemarle Street. Imagine the scene. A grand hall filled with London's elite, all eager to hear the great Humphrey Davy. On stage, Davy demonstrated the wonders of chemistry with brilliance and flair. Explosions, colored flames, dazzling experiments, the audience was enthralled. Among them sat Michael Faraday, the bookbinder's apprentice, wide-eyed, scribbling notes furiously. For him, this was no mere entertainment. It was revelation. The world he had only glimpsed in books was alive before his eyes. Nature's secrets were not distant abstractions, but tangible, visible, real. He filled his notebooks with sketches and descriptions, binding them together into a volume that would later serve as both record and petition. For Faraday resolved not merely to watch, but to act. He would send these notes to Davy, asking for a position, any position at the Royal Institution. It took boldness for a poor apprentice to write to one of the most famous men in England, but Faraday had boldness born of desperation and passion. He sent Davy his notes, humbly requesting employment as an assistant. Davy, to his credit, recognized the young man's diligence. Though at first there was no opening, fate soon intervened. After a laboratory assistant was dismissed for misconduct, Davy offered Faraday the position. And so, in 1813, Michael Faraday entered the Royal Institution not as a guest, not as a gentleman, but as a servant. He began by cleaning, preparing equipment, performing tasks of drudgery, yet for him it was paradise. He was inside the temple of science, and he was determined never to leave. Looking back, it is clear that Faraday's apprenticeship was the crucible of his genius. It gave him access to books, trained him in self-education, and instilled the habits of note-taking and experimentation. It exposed him to mentors and opportunities that would alter his life. Without poverty, perhaps he would never have worked in a bookshop. Without the bookshop, he might never have read Marseille or Watts. Without those books, he might never have understood Davy's lectures. Without Davy's lectures, he might never have entered the Royal Institution. Thus, what seemed like limitation became preparation. The boy who bound books was binding himself to knowledge, thread by thread, until he was ready to weave his own discoveries into the fabric of science. In March 1813, Michael Faraday's life changed. Humphrey Davy, impressed by the young man's notes and diligence, offered him the position of laboratory assistant at the Royal Institution. For Faraday, this was a dream realized. He walked through the grand doors of the institution not as a spectator, but as a worker within. The Royal Institution was no ordinary place. Founded in 1799 to advance science and diffuse knowledge, it had become a center of research and public lectures. Its laboratories were alive with experiments in chemistry and physics. Its lecture hall resounded with demonstrations that dazzled audiences. To Faraday, stepping into this environment was like entering a cathedral of knowledge. But his role was humble. He cleaned glassware, prepared chemicals, set up equipment. He was, in essence, a servant of science. Yet he embraced it wholeheartedly. Every task was an opportunity to learn. Every experiment he prepared was a lesson. At first, Humphrey Davy treated Faraday kindly. He recognized the young man's intelligence and promised him opportunities. In Davy's laboratory, Faraday observed experiments in electrochemistry, listened to discussions of scientific theory, and absorbed the methods of research. But the relationship was not simple. Davy was a brilliant chemist, famous for isolating new elements and inventing the safety lamp for miners. He was also ambitious, proud, and sensitive to rivals. As Faraday's star began to rise, Davy's attitude cooled. He praised Faraday publicly, but sometimes belittled him privately, perhaps out of jealousy. Elites took him on travels and gave him access to experiences far beyond what the son of a blacksmith could have imagined. In October 1813, Davy embarked on a grand tour of Europe, accompanied by his wife Jane and his new assistant, Michael Faraday. The journey would last 18 months and take them through France, Italy, Switzerland, and beyond. For Faraday, it was a university without walls, a chance to meet the greatest scientists of the age, to see new lands, and to witness science at its forefront. The realities, however, were far from idyllic. Lady Davy, proud and disdainful, treated Faraday as little more than a servant. He carried luggage, ran errands, and endured humiliations. In letters, he confessed his frustration but also his determination. He knew that beneath the hardship lay opportunity. And indeed, the tour proved invaluable. In Paris, Faraday met André Marie Ampère, whose work on electricity and magnetism fascinated him. In Italy, he encountered Volta's pile, the first battery, and learned of Alessandro Volta's experiments. In Geneva, he visited laboratories and observed cutting-edge research. Everywhere, he absorbed knowledge like a sponge. Faraday's notebooks from the journey are filled with observations not just of experiments, but of landscapes, cultures, and people. He saw the Alps, the ruins of Rome, the galleries of Florence. For a boy who had grown up in poverty, it was a revelation. The world was vast, beautiful, and filled with mystery. The European tour was also a test of character. Faraday endured Lady Davy's scorn, the menial tasks assigned to him, and the constant reminder of his low status. Yet he did not allow bitterness to consume him. He served faithfully, learned diligently, and held fast to his humility. These experiences deepened his resilience. They reminded him that science was not about comfort or privilege, but about perseverance. He saw firsthand the arrogance of some elites and resolved never to imitate it. He would be a different kind of scientist, humble, accessible, devoted not to status but to truth. In April 1815, Faraday returned to England with the Davys. The tour had broadened his horizons immeasurably. He had met great scientists, seen great experiments, and tasted the richness of European culture. He had also endured trials that strengthened his character. Back at the Royal Institution, he resumed his work as laboratory assistant. But he was no longer merely an apprentice. He was beginning to see himself as a man of science in his own right. He began to conduct his own experiments, to write papers, to build a reputation. Still, recognition was slow. His lack of formal education continued to be a barrier. Some regarded him as merely a skilled technician, not a thinker. But Faraday persisted. He knew that patience, diligence, and truth would speak louder than prejudice. During these years, Faraday laid the foundations of his future discoveries. He immersed himself in chemistry, conducting experiments on gases, liquids, and reactions. He developed extraordinary skill as an experimentalist, able to design simple yet ingenious apparatus with limited resources. He also honed his ability as a lecturer. At the Royal Institution, he assisted in demonstrations, observed techniques of communication, and began to develop his own style. He learned that science was not only about discovery, but about sharing discovery, making it vivid and accessible. All of this grew from the habits he had formed as a child and apprentice: curiosity, observation, discipline, humility. The boy who had once bound books was now binding together the threads of knowledge into new patterns. Though Faraday could not yet know it, the seeds of his greatest work were already planted. His fascination with electricity and magnetism, sparked during his tour of Europe, would soon lead him to experiments that changed the world. But even before fame arrived, Faraday's life was already remarkable. He had risen from poverty to stand among the great scientists of his age. He had endured scorn without losing humility, hardship without losing faith, obscurity without losing hope. His story was still beginning. The genius without degrees was about to step into the light. Looking back, it is clear that Faraday's childhood and apprenticeship were not hindrances but hidden blessings. Poverty gave him resilience. Lack of schooling gave him independence. The bookbinder's shop gave him access to knowledge. The European tour gave him breadth of vision. Each step, though humble or difficult, prepared him for greatness. Each trial forged his character. Each opportunity, seized with gratitude, built his destiny. Faraday's life reminds us that beginnings need not define endings, that hardship can shape strength, that obscurity can nurture greatness, that humility can walk hand in hand with genius. By the end of the 1812nd, Michael Faraday was no longer just an assistant. He was a young scientist with growing reputation, ready to make his mark. The next chapter of his life would see him move from obscurity to recognition, from student to discoverer, from servant to master of the laboratory. And so, as we close the story of his humble beginnings, we prepare to enter the story of his rise, the years in which Michael Faraday, the bookbinder's apprentice, would become Michael Faraday, the discoverer of electromagnetism. By the late 1812, Michael Faraday's position at the Royal Institution had begun to shift. Though still officially an assistant, he was no longer merely preparing experiments for others, he was conducting his own. The transition from servant to scientist was gradual, but decisive. In 1816, Faraday gave his first public lecture on the properties of matter at the City Philosophical Society, a group of young men who gathered to discuss science. Nervous but determined, he spoke with clarity and enthusiasm. It was the beginning of a career as one of the greatest lecturers of his age. At the same time, he began publishing short papers in scientific journals. These early works, though modest, signaled that Faraday was no longer content to watch from the sidelines. He had something to contribute. He was finding his voice. Chemistry was Faraday's first scientific love. He immersed himself in experiments on gases and compounds, building on the work of Davy and others. He investigated the properties of chlorine, experimented with new kinds of glass, and developed methods for liquefying gases under pressure. His diligence and ingenuity won him respect. In 1823, he succeeded in liquefying chlorine and other gases, a feat that astonished his peers. He also discovered benzene, an organic compound that would later prove central to chemistry and industry. These achievements were the fruit of habits formed long before habits of observation, patience, and precision. The boy who once copied books now recorded experiments with the same care, binding knowledge into order. Despite his accomplishments, recognition was not immediate. Faraday's lack of formal education continued to shadow him. Some in the Royal Society regarded him as a skilled technician rather than a true thinker. His early papers were scrutinized with skepticism, but Faraday did not despair. He knew that acceptance would come not from argument but from results. He trusted that truth, patiently pursued, would speak louder than prejudice. And gradually it did. His discoveries accumulated, his reputation grew, and his position within the scientific community strengthened. By the mid-1822nd, Faraday was no longer dismissed as Davy's assistant. He was acknowledged as a rising star in his own right. Through these years, Faraday's character remained consistent. He lived simply, avoided debt, and worked tirelessly. He was devoted to his wife, Sarah Barnard, whom he married in 1821 after a brief courtship. Their marriage was happy though childless, marked by mutual affection and shared faith. Sarah provided Michael with stability and comfort, allowing him to devote himself to science without distraction. Their relationship, rooted in love and simplicity, became a source of strength throughout his life. Faraday's faith also deepened in these years. As a Sandemanian, he attended services regularly, participated in church life, and sought to align his work with his beliefs. He saw no divide between science and religion. Both were ways of seeking truth. Faraday's skill as a lecturer began to attract attention. Unlike some contemporaries, who spoke in lofty tones, he explained science in plain language, with vivid demonstrations. He believed that knowledge should not be hidden in jargon, but made clear to all. This conviction stemmed from his own experience. As a boy with little schooling, he had learned from books written for ordinary readers. He never forgot this. In his lectures, he sought to be for others what Jane Marcet had been for him, a guide who made the difficult understandable. His style combined passion with humility. He did not present himself as a genius, but as a fellow inquirer, sharing discoveries with his audience. He invited wonder, not awe. As Faraday's reputation grew, he never forgot where he had come from. Poverty, hardship, and exclusion had shaped him, and he carried those lessons always. He lived without extravagance, refused knighthood, and declined opportunities that would have bound him to politics or wealth. When young students asked how they might succeed, he did not point to degrees or titles, but to curiosity, diligence, and honesty. He told them that knowledge must be pursued for its own sake, not for personal gain. Faraday's humility was not feigned, it was real, rooted in his origins. He never ceased to see himself as the bookbinder's apprentice who had been fortunate enough to enter the world of science. The decade of the 1822nd marked Michael Faraday's transformation from apprentice to scientist, from an obscure laboratory assistant to a man recognized for his own discoveries. His early years at the Royal Institution had been spent largely in service, preparing experiments, assisting Davy, enduring the sneers of those who saw him as a mechanic rather than a thinker. But now Faraday began to find his footing. The change did not happen overnight. It was the result of patience, discipline, and relentless curiosity. Faraday's notebooks from this period are filled with meticulous records of experiments, observations, and reflections. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, not for glory, but for the joy of discovery. His character, humble, diligent, persevering, was beginning to bear fruit. Faraday's first major contributions were in chemistry, a field that fascinated him as much as electricity would later. He had learned chemistry from Davy, but his own experiments soon carried him further. In 1823, he succeeded in liquefying chlorine gas by compressing and cooling it. At the time, many gases were thought to be permanent, impossible to turn into liquids. Faraday's achievement proved otherwise, opening new paths for the study of matter. He went on to liquefy several other gases, including hydrogen chloride and sulfur dioxide, demonstrating that so-called permanent gases could indeed be condensed. That same year, he discovered benzene, a hydrocarbon that would become central to organic chemistry and industry. At the time, he could scarcely have guessed how important this simple ring-shaped molecule would become in fuels, plastics, dyes, and countless products. But his discovery showed once again his gift for seeing what others had overlooked. Faraday also investigated alloys of steel and produced high-quality optical glass for use in scientific instruments. These contributions, though sometimes overshadowed by his later work in electricity, were significant in their own right. They established him as a chemist of skill and imagination. Gradually, the scientific community began to take notice. In 1824, Faraday was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, a remarkable achievement for a man of his background. The recognition did not come easily. There were still whispers that he was only a technician. But the weight of his discoveries silenced the doubters. With fellowship came respect, though Faraday never allowed it to inflate his ego. He remained plain. Mr. Faraday, never sir, even when offered knighthood later in life. Titles did not interest him. What mattered was truth. In 1821, Faraday married Sarah Barnard, the daughter of a Sandemanian family. Their marriage was a source of profound happiness. Though they had no children, the bond between them was deep and enduring. Sarah provided Michael with a home filled with warmth, faith, and stability. She supported his work, endured his long hours in the laboratory, and shared in his triumphs and struggles. Faraday often spoke of Sarah as his greatest earthly blessing. In a life filled with discoveries, she was his constant companion. Their marriage grounded him, giving him strength to face the demands of science and the pressures of fame. Though chemistry occupied much of Faraday's early career, electricity was never far from his mind. He had witnessed demonstrations of electrical phenomena during his European tour with Davy, and the subject fascinated him. In 1821, inspired by Hans Christian Øysted's discovery that electric currents could deflect magnetic needles, Faraday began experiments that would lead to the first electric motor. Using a simple setup of a wire carrying current and a magnet, Faraday showed that a current-carrying conductor could rotate around a magnetic pole, a direct conversion of electrical energy into mechanical motion. This was the principle of the electric motor, though Faraday himself saw it only as an experimental curiosity. The demonstration astonished his contemporaries. It was the first time electricity had been shown to produce continuous motion. Though it would take decades for practical motors to be developed, Faraday had laid the foundation. The world of industry would never be the same. What distinguished Faraday was not only what he discovered, but how he discovered. He was an experimental philosopher in the truest sense, guided not by abstract theory, but by hands-on investigation. He designed elegant experiments, stripped to essentials, that revealed nature's laws with clarity. He distrusted speculation that was not grounded in observation. Work, finish, publish was his motto, a reflection of his belief that science must rest on experiment, not mere conjecture. His humility kept him from overreaching. His diligence ensured that his results were sound. This approach won him admiration even among those who doubted his education. Faraday might lack the mathematical sophistication of a Cambridge scholar, but he possessed something rarer, a genius for revealing truth through experiment. By the mid-1822nd, Faraday was firmly established as a man of science. He continued to publish papers, conduct experiments, and lecture at the Royal Institution. His reputation grew not only in Britain, but across Europe. He was admired for his discoveries, but also for his character. Unlike some scientists of the era who pursued wealth or fame, Faraday remained modest and unpretentious. He lived simply, worked diligently, and shared his findings freely. He believed that science was a gift to be given, not a commodity to be sold. This integrity made him a beloved figure. Colleagues trusted him. The public admired him. He was becoming not only a scientist, but a symbol, a man who embodied the virtues of humility, honesty, and dedication to truth. As the 1822nd came to a close, Faraday stood at the threshold of greatness. He had made his mark in chemistry, earned recognition in the Royal Society, and begun to explore the mysterious relationship between electricity and magnetism. The next decade would bring his most famous discoveries, the experiments on electromagnetic induction that would revolutionize physics and technology. But even as he prepared to step into that spotlight, he carried with him the lessons of his beginnings, the humility of poverty, the faith of his family, the discipline of the bookbinder's bench. Michael Faraday was ready. The world, though it did not yet know it, was about to change. By the late 1822nd, Michael Faraday was no longer a background figure at the Royal Institution. He had earned respect as a chemist, secured a fellowship in the Royal Society, and built a reputation as a capable lecturer. Yet his humility never wavered. In his own eyes, he remained a student of nature, seeking truth through experiment. The years had given him confidence, but not arrogance. He was beginning to believe not only that he could conduct important experiments, but that he might uncover principles no one else had seen. This conviction, coupled with his tireless energy, propelled him toward discoveries that would transform science. Though the world would remember him primarily for electricity, Faraday continued to make significant contributions to chemistry throughout the late 1822nd. He developed new alloys of steel and studied their properties, work that would prove valuable for tools and instruments. He also produced special types of optical glass, experimenting with different mixtures to improve clarity and durability. This research would later connect to his investigations of light and magnetism. Faraday's chemical expertise was widely respected. When industry or government required advice on materials, he was often consulted. His ability to translate laboratory findings into practical applications made him invaluable. Yet for Faraday, chemistry was never only about utility. It was about understanding the nature of matter, the hidden structures and forces that gave rise to the visible world. Faraday's reputation as a lecturer blossomed in these years. At the Royal Institution, he began to take over more responsibilities from senior figures, delivering talks to both scientific audiences and the general public. His style was unique. He avoided jargon, preferring clear, simple language. He used vivid demonstrations, dramatic but always precise, to make abstract concepts tangible. Audiences were captivated not only by the experiments, but by the man himself, whose enthusiasm was infectious. The Christmas lectures, aimed at young audiences, became his special joy. He believed passionately that children should be inspired by science, that wonder should be cultivated from an early age. These lectures became a tradition that continues even today, more than 150 years after his death. Through these talks, Faraday helped democratize science. He showed that it was not the property of an elite few, but a treasure for all humanity. In 1821, Faraday had demonstrated the principle of the electric motor, showing that a current-carrying wire could rotate around a magnetic pole. It was an ingenious experiment, but he left the implications largely unexplored. Others, including William Sturgeon and Joseph Henry, would refine the concept. Yet Faraday remained fascinated by the relationship between electricity and magnetism. In the late 1822nd, he returned to the subject with renewed determination. He sensed that a deeper connection existed, one that could unlock profound truths. Hans Christian Risted's discovery that electric currents produce magnetic effects had shown one half of the relationship. Faraday wondered, could the opposite also be true? Could magnetism generate electricity? This question would guide his work into the 1832nd, culminating in the discovery of electromagnetic induction, the principle that underlies modern electrical technology. Faraday's genius lay not in complex apparatus, but in clarity. His experiments were often elegantly simple. He stripped away distractions, focusing only on the essential elements. For example, in exploring electricity and magnetism, he used coils of wire, magnets, and simple circuits. He was not the first to experiment with these materials, but he was the one who saw the hidden connections. His mind grasped patterns that others overlooked. He also had extraordinary patience. He could repeat experiments hundreds of times, varying conditions minutely, until patterns emerged. Where others grew bored, Faraday grew more fascinated. Each failure was a clue, each anomaly a signpost. By 1830, Faraday's thoughts were converging on the great question: could a magnetic field create an electric current? At the time, no one knew. Many suspected it was impossible. Electric currents seemed to flow only when connected to a battery. Magnetism, though mysterious, appeared static. To imagine that a moving magnet could generate electricity seemed fanciful. But Faraday trusted his instincts. His mental picture of lines of force, imaginary curves, radiating from magnets, suggested that motion through these lines might induce an effect. He resolved to test it. In 1831, after years of preparation, he performed the crucial experiments that revealed the truth. By moving a magnet through a coil of wire, he generated an electric current. By varying the arrangement, he demonstrated the principles of induction. The effect was small, but undeniable. Electricity could be generated not only by chemical means, batteries, but by magnetic action. Faraday had opened the door to the modern electrical age. The news of Faraday's induction experiments spread quickly. Scientists across Europe marveled. Here was a discovery of profound significance, with implications far beyond the laboratory. It suggested that electricity and magnetism were not separate phenomena, but aspects of a unified force. Faraday himself remained modest. He presented his findings carefully, without exaggeration, focusing on the experimental evidence, but others saw the magnitude of what he had achieved. In time, his name would be forever linked with the birth of electrical science. Even as his reputation grew, Faraday's personal life remained simple. He and Sarah lived quietly, content with modest means. He avoided debt, shunned extravagance, and kept his focus on science and faith. His Sandemanian beliefs shaped his decisions. He refused opportunities that might compromise his principles. He declined to profit from his discoveries, refusing patents. He believed knowledge was a gift to be shared, not sold. This integrity made him unique in an age when many scientists sought wealth or prestige. Faraday remained true to his beginnings, the humble apprentice who loved truth more than honor. By the early 1832nd, Faraday had secured his place in the scientific world. He was respected as a chemist, admired as a lecturer, and beginning to be celebrated as the discoverer of new principles in electricity. Yet he sensed that his work had only begun. The connection between electricity and magnetism hinted at deeper laws still hidden. Light, magnetism, and electricity, were they perhaps linked in some grand unity? Elevate him from respected scientist to immortal figure. By 1830, Michael Faraday stood at the threshold of discovery. He had already shown in 1821 that electricity could produce motion, the principle of the electric motor. But the greater question remained unanswered. Could the process work in reverse? Could magnetism produce electricity? For years, this possibility had haunted him. He knew from Hans Christian Risted's work that an electric current could deflect a compass needle. He knew from André Marie Ampère that electricity and magnetism were intertwined. But how deep did the connection go? Could there be a way to generate electricity not from chemical batteries, but directly from magnetic action? This was no idle speculation. If true, it would reveal a new source of power for humanity, a force as fundamental as steam, but invisible and inexhaustible. Faraday resolved to test the idea with the patience and precision that defined his approach. The scene was the Royal Institution Laboratory, modest by modern standards but rich with curiosity. Wooden tables, coils of copper wire, magnets, glass jars, and iron filings were his tools. There was no glamour here, only diligence. In the summer of 1831, Faraday began the experiments that would change history. His method was simple. Take a coil of wire, connect it to a galvanometer, an instrument that detects current, and see what happens when a magnet is moved near it. At first, nothing. The needle lay still. Then, as he pushed the magnet into the coil, the needle twitched. When he pulled the magnet out, it twitched again, this time in the opposite direction. Faraday had seen it. Motion of a magnet produced electricity. He repeated the experiment with variations, moving coils near each other, winding wires differently, changing the speed of motion. Each time the result confirmed the same principle. Electricity could be induced by changing magnetic conditions. It was a moment of revelation. Electricity and magnetism were not separate mysteries, but partners in a dance of nature. Faraday's observations revealed what would later be formalized as the law of electromagnetic induction. An electric current is induced in a conductor when it experiences a change in magnetic flux. Faraday himself did not speak of flux or Wright equations. He described what he saw. The way lines of force seemed to be cut by the wire, producing current. His language was pictorial, his reasoning visual. Yet his insights were so profound that later physicists, armed with mathematics, would find his descriptions remarkably accurate. The modern form of Faraday's law, expressed in Maxwell's equations, would not appear until decades later. But the essence was already there in 1831, born from the twitch of a needle and the imagination of a humble experimenter. One experiment in particular showed the practical power of his discovery. Faraday constructed a simple device, a copper disc rotated between the poles of a magnet with electrical contacts at the center and rim. As the disc spun, a continuous current was produced. This was the first dynamo, the ancestor of all modern electrical generators. Though crude, it demonstrated that mechanical motion could be converted directly into electrical energy. The age of electricity had begun. Faraday himself did not foresee the Industrial Revolution that would follow. He saw his device as a scientific demonstration, not a machine for power, but inventors and engineers would soon seize upon it, building dynamos that powered factories, cities, and nations. The spark he struck in 1831 became the fire of modern civilization. Equally revolutionary was Faraday's way of understanding what he had seen. He imagined that space around a magnet or current was filled with invisible lines of force. These lines, though unseen, carried real influence. When a conductor moved through them, electricity was induced. To mathematicians of the time, this seemed vague. But Faraday's vision was profound. He was conceiving of fields, regions of space, filled with physical properties. This idea, radical in 1831, would become central to physics. Maxwell would later give it mathematical form. Einstein would build upon it, and modern science would embrace it as fundamental. Faraday's gift was to see with the mind's eye what others could not, the invisible architecture of nature. When Faraday presented his findings in 1831, the scientific world was astonished. Here was a discovery of immense importance, explained with clarity and backed by elegant experiments. Some contemporaries struggled to grasp the implications. They admired the ingenuity, but did not immediately see the technological potential. Others, however, sensed its magnitude. Faraday's reputation soared. He was no longer the assistant or the technician. He was the discoverer of a new law of nature. The Royal Society recognized the achievement with honors. Across Europe, scientists repeated his experiments and confirmed the results. The name of Faraday became synonymous with electricity. Despite the acclaim, Faraday remained humble. He refused to patent the dynamo principle, believing that knowledge should belong to all. He lived simply, gave freely, and continued his experiments with undiminished curiosity. He wrote in his notebooks not of personal glory, but of nature's beauty. To him, the discovery was not his but God's. He was merely the observer. His faith and humility kept him grounded, even as the world hailed him. Faraday's great breakthrough of 1831, the discovery of electromagnetic induction, was not the end, but the beginning of a new era in his career. The 1832nd would see him refine his ideas, extend his experiments, and deepen his reputation as the greatest experimentalist of his generation. He did not rest on his laurels. Immediately after publishing his findings, he embarked on further investigations. Could induction occur in different materials? How strong were the effects under varying conditions? Could the principles be applied in new ways? His curiosity was endless, his energy tireless. Faraday returned repeatedly to the dynamo, testing different configurations of disks, coils, and magnets. He experimented with alternating currents, with multiple loops of wire, with variations in speed. He demonstrated that induction was not a fluke, but a universal law. Wherever magnetic fields changed, electricity was born. These refinements provided the conceptual blueprint for future engineers. While Faraday himself did not build industrial machines, his demonstrations were clear enough that others could see the possibilities. Within decades, practical dynamos were constructed, powering the first electrical grids. One of Faraday's most important conceptual contributions in the 1832nd was his insistence on thinking in terms of field. He described the lines of force surrounding magnets and currents, lines that could be stretched, bent, and cut. To many contemporaries, this language seemed vague, almost mystical, but Faraday's intuition was profound. He was describing what physicists would later formalize as the electromagnetic field, a concept at the heart of modern physics. James Clerk Maxwell, who translated Faraday's vision into mathematical equations in the 1862nd, later admitted that without Faraday's imagery, his own work would have been impossible. Thus, Faraday's genius lay not only in what he discovered, but in how he imagined. Even as electricity consumed much of his attention, Faraday never abandoned chemistry. Throughout the 1832nd, he continued to publish papers on chemical analysis, materials, and reactions. He developed new methods of electrolysis, showing how electrical currents could split compounds into their elements. His precise experiments established the laws of electrolysis, which remain fundamental to electrochemistry. He also continued to work with glass, creating specialized optical materials for use in instruments. These experiments would later connect to his investigations of light and magnetism, leading to the discovery of the Faraday effect in 1845. Faraday's ability to move fluidly between chemistry and physics set him apart. He was not bound by disciplinary boundaries. For him, nature was a unity, and truth could be pursued wherever it appeared. Faraday's public reputation soared in these years. His lectures at the Royal Institution drew overflowing audiences, including royalty, statesmen, and common citizens alike. His style, clear, enthusiastic, and dramatic, made science come alive. He delighted in showing that profound truths could be revealed through simple objects: a candle flame, a magnet, a coil of wire. His lecture series, The Chemical History of a Candle, remains one of the most beloved pieces of popular science writing, capturing his ability to find wonder in the ordinary. Through these talks, Faraday became a cultural figure as well as a scientific one. He was seen as a man of integrity, a moral voice, a symbol of the power of knowledge. The 1832nd brought honors. Learned societies across Europe invited him to join. Governments sought his advice. He was awarded medals and prizes. His peers recognized him not merely as an able chemist, but as a pioneer of a new physics. Yet Faraday accepted honors with reluctance. He remained uninterested in wealth or titles. He declined knighthood, preferring to remain simply Mr. Faraday. When offered prestigious positions, he often refused, choosing instead to remain free to pursue research. This humility endeared him to the public. In an age of ambition, he was a man apart, devoted not to himself, but to truth. By the dawn of the 1842nd, Michael Faraday was already a legend. His discovery of electromagnetic induction in 1831 had secured his place among the greatest of experimental philosophers. Yet Faraday was not satisfied with isolated triumphs. He hungered for deeper understanding. To him, the forces of nature were not separate curiosities, but threads of a single tapestry. Electricity, magnetism, chemistry, and light. Might they all be connected? Could nature in all its complexity be governed by a unity of laws? This question became Faraday's guiding vision. It was not simply a scientific problem, but a philosophical quest. He believed that the Creator's design must be orderly and harmonious. If electricity and magnetism were linked, and if both could influence matter, then perhaps even light itself, the most ethereal of phenomena, belonged to the same family. And so, in the 1842nd, Faraday began a series of experiments that would once again change the course of physics. Faraday's laboratory at the Royal Institution remained simple: coils, wires, magnets, glass, and chemicals. But from these humble tools, he conjured visions that would anticipate modern field theory. He asked himself, if magnetism can induce electricity, could it also affect light? Light was widely believed to be a wave, but what kind of wave? Some said it was a vibration of an invisible, luminiferous ether. Faraday wondered if it might instead be connected to electromagnetic action. To test this, he designed experiments with transparent materials placed in magnetic fields. He passed polarized light through glass and liquids while subjecting them to strong magnetic influence. Again and again he tried, failing repeatedly, until at last success. In 1845, Faraday made one of his most remarkable discoveries. Magnetism could affect light. When polarized light passed through heavy glass in a magnetic field, the plane of polarization rotated. The direction of rotation depended on the direction of the magnetic field. This phenomenon, now known as the Faraday effect, was the first experimental evidence that light and magnetism were related. It was a stunning result. For the first time, two seemingly distinct forces of nature, optics and electromagnetism, were shown to be connected. Faraday had uncovered a bridge between disciplines. Humbly, leaving it to future generations to build on them. Indeed, it would be James Clerk Maxwell who 2 decades later would incorporate the Faraday effect into his grand equations of electromagnetism, showing that light itself is an electromagnetic wave. After discovering the Faraday effect in 1845, Faraday did not rest. His mind was restless, probing, always seeking the next connection. That same year, he embarked on a series of experiments that revealed yet another dimension of magnetism, diamagnetism. At the time, scientists knew that certain materials, like iron, cobalt, and nickel, were strongly attracted to magnets. These were the ferromagnetic substances. But what of other materials, glass, wood, water? Were they unaffected? Faraday, never content with assumptions, tested them all. He suspended small samples of substances between the poles of powerful electromagnets and carefully observed their behavior. To his astonishment, many materials were repelled by the magnetic field. This phenomenon, repulsion by a magnetic field, was entirely new. Faraday called it diamagnetism, distinguishing it from the attraction of ferromagnetism. Diamagnetism, though weaker than ferromagnetism, was universal. Every material, Faraday found, responded to magnetic forces in some way, either attracted or repelled. There was no such thing as a substance immune to magnetism. This was a profound insight. It suggested that magnetism, like gravity, was a universal property of matter. No longer could magnetism be thought of as a peculiarity of iron or lodestones. It was woven into the fabric of all things. Faraday's experiments with diamagnetism were marvels of creativity. He designed delicate apparatus to suspend tiny crystals, drops of liquid, and thin plates of material between magnetic poles. With patience and precision, he recorded their minute deflections. He observed, for example, that a bismuth crystal aligned itself across the magnetic field, while an iron crystal aligned along it. He found that even flames and gases responded to magnetic influence. Such results shocked the scientific community. To think that even air, fire, and living tissue were subject to magnetism, this was a radical expansion of physical knowledge. Faraday's work on diamagnetism opened new fields of study. Later, physicists would explore the molecular origins of magnetic behavior, leading to quantum theories of electron spin. But it was Faraday who first revealed the universality of magnetic forces. Faraday was not only an experimentalist, but also a philosopher of science. He wrote often about method, evidence, and the limits of human knowledge. To Faraday, experiment was supreme. He distrusted speculation unmoored from observation. He believed that theories should serve experiments, not the other way around. "Let the results be given fairly," he wrote, "whether they are for or against the views we cherish." This humility before nature was the secret of his success. He never forced results into preconceived frameworks. Instead, he allowed phenomena to speak, to reveal their own logic. And yet Faraday was not devoid of imagination. His concept of fields so daring, so visionary, was itself a theoretical leap. But he grounded it always in experiment, drawing diagrams, testing predictions, and refining his ideas in the crucible of observation. This balance of imagination and empiricism made him unique. It allowed him to pioneer concepts that others dismissed, yet also to convince them by the weight of evidence. Faraday's philosophy of science was deeply intertwined with his faith. As a member of the Sandemanian Church, he believed in the unity of truth. Nature was the work of God, and to study it was an act of reverence. This conviction gave him patience in failure and humility in success. He did not seek personal glory, but the revelation of natural laws. When asked about ambition, he replied simply, "I have no ambition. I have no design but to work for science." And this attitude endeared him to the public, who saw in him not only a genius, but a man of character. To his fellow scientists, it sometimes made him enigmatic, for he refused honors and avoided political entanglements. But all agreed that his integrity was unshakable. Faraday's work in the late 1842 pushed deeper into the relationship between magnetism and matter. He wondered, what does magnetism reveal about the inner constitution of materials? He suspected that magnetism arose from the arrangement of particles within matter. Though he could not articulate it in terms of atoms and electrons, as later science would, he intuited that the forces he studied were tied to the microscopic world. In this sense, Faraday was a forerunner of modern physics. His idea that invisible fields pervaded space and matter anticipated the quantum and relativistic revolutions of the 20th century. But in his own time, his vision remained controversial. Many physicists still clung to mechanical models, insisting that light waves required an ether and that forces acted only through contact. Faraday's field seemed mystical, even unscientific. Yet he persevered, convinced that nature itself bore witness to their reality. Throughout the 1842nd and 1852nd, Faraday continued to deliver public lectures at the Royal Institution. These were not dry recitations, but dramatic performances. He demonstrated magnetism with floating needles, induction with sparks and coils, and chemical reactions with dazzling colors. Children gasped, adults applauded, and newspapers spread the word. Faraday understood that science belonged not only to specialists, but to the public. His lectures, especially the famous Christmas lectures for young people, inspired generations. In these talks, he wove stories of discovery, blending wonder with clear explanation. One boy who attended the Christmas lectures in 1850 was James Clerk Maxwell. Decades later, Maxwell would mathematically prove the unity of electricity, magnetism, and light, fulfilling Faraday's dream. Faraday's discoveries reverberated worldwide. In France, Germany, and America, scientists rushed to replicate his experiments. His publications were translated, his name revered. He was elected a member of numerous academies, awarded medals, and courted by politicians. Yet he declined knighthood and refused burial honors, choosing instead the simple life of a servant of truth. To foreign visitors, meeting Faraday was a pilgrimage. They found not a haughty aristocrat, but a modest man in plain clothes, eager to show them his laboratory. Many left with the impression not only of a great scientist, but of a saintly character. But fame could not shield Faraday from frailty. By the late 1842nd, his health began to deteriorate. Years of inhaling fumes and handling chemicals had damaged his body. He suffered from headaches, memory lapses, and periods of exhaustion. In 1855, he wrote to a friend, "My health is very uncertain. I sometimes fear I may be losing the power of clear thought." At times, he had to withdraw from research altogether, retreating to Hampton Court, where Queen Victoria had granted him a house. There he tended gardens, walked in the countryside, and found solace in nature. Yet whenever strength returned, he returned to the laboratory. His love of discovery was irrepressible. Despite illness, Faraday's work in the 1852nd remained influential. He explored the nature of dielectrics, the behavior of charged particles, and the propagation of fields. His research notes from this period are filled with sketches of lines of force, arrows, and curves, visualizations of phenomena that mathematics would later capture in equation. He wrote of space as the seat of force, a phrase that would echo through physics for generations. He speculated that light itself was an electromagnetic vibration. Though he could not prove it, he had intuited the truth that Maxwell would later demonstrate. Faraday's vision was now clear. Electricity, magnetism, and light were not separate phenomena, but manifestations of a single underlying reality. By the mid-1852nd, it was evident to all that Faraday's discoveries had reshaped science. His induction coils powered telegraphs. His field concept guided young theorists. His lectures inspired a public eager for knowledge. And yet, Faraday himself remained humble. He spoke of his discoveries not as personal triumphs, but as glimpses into the Creator's design. He saw himself as an instrument, not a master. This humility, combined with brilliance, made him beloved. He was the rare scientist, admired equally by colleagues, the public, and even royalty. As the 1852nd drew to a close, Faraday stood at once at the height of fame and the edge of decline. His health limited his experiments, yet his influence grew stronger than ever. The boy who had once bound books now bound together the forces of nature. Electricity, magnetism, and light, once separate, were converging in his vision of unity. He had not written equations, but he had sketched the architecture of reality, and soon others would build upon his foundation, raising the cathedral of modern physics. To Victorian society, Faraday had become more than a scientist. He was a cultural icon, a living saint of knowledge. Newspapers described him as the Shakespeare of science. Politicians invoked his name as proof of British genius. Children read stories of the boy apprentice who rose to greatness. Yet what made Faraday beloved was not merely his discoveries, it was his character. In an age of industrial ambition, he stood apart, unassuming, incorruptible, generous. He never sought wealth, power, or prestige. He sought only truth. This purity made him a moral compass in turbulent times. Amid the smoke of factories and the noise of machines, Faraday represented a different vision of progress, one rooted in wisdom and humility. On the 25th of August, 1867, Michael Faraday died peacefully at the age of 75. His death was mourned across the world. Scientists, statesmen, and ordinary citizens paid tribute to the man who had lit their homes and transformed their lives. At his funeral, there were no grand processions, no royal fanfare, just a quiet gathering of family and friends, laying to rest the man who had refused every honor but had achieved immortality through his work. In time, memorials arose. Statues in London, plaques in institutions, laboratories bearing his name. The unit of electrical capacitance, the farad, ensured that every student of science would encounter his legacy. His portrait appeared on banknotes, his name on schools and lecture halls, but perhaps the greatest memorial was invisible. The web of power lines stretching across continents, carrying the electricity that his discoveries had made possible. Every light bulb, every motor, every telegraph signal was a silent hymn to Faraday's genius. Faraday's story did not end with his death. It became a beacon for generations of scientists, inventors, and dreamers. Thomas Edison, the American inventor of the light bulb, drew upon Faraday's principles. So did Nikola Tesla with his alternating current systems. James Clerk Maxwell turned Faraday's intuition into the equations that still govern physics. Albert Einstein, reflecting on his own work, once remarked that when he stood on the shoulders of giants, Faraday was among them. The vision of fields and energy that Faraday pioneered paved the way for relativity and quantum mechanics. In classrooms around the world, students still repeat Faraday's experiments with coils and magnets, watching sparks leap across wires. Each demonstration is a small reenactment of the moment when Faraday changed humanity's destiny. What does Faraday's life teach us? It teaches that greatness is not measured by titles or wealth, but by curiosity, integrity, and service. It teaches that knowledge is not the possession of the few, but the birthright of all. It teaches that even the humblest beginnings can lead to world-changing discoveries. Faraday's life answers the opening question, why do some call him the unlettered genius who lit up humanity? Because he showed that education is not confined to classrooms, that imagination can outstrip privilege, and that the light of understanding can shine from the most unlikely places. Faraday's legacy remains unfinished. The technologies he unleashed continue to evolve: renewable energy grids, electric vehicles, global communications, quantum computers. Each new advance traces its ancestry to that moment in 1831 when he first induced current with a magnet and coil. But beyond technology, Faraday's life leaves a more profound challenge. It asks each generation, what will you do with the light you inherit? Will you use it for greed and power, or for service and wonder? Faraday cannot answer this for us. He has given us the gift of possibility. The rest is ours to decide. Michael Faraday's life was a candle burning brightly in the darkness of ignorance. It lit the path not only for scientists, but for all humanity. And though his body rests in a quiet grave, the flame he kindled continues to burn in every lamp that glows, in every motor that hums, in every circuit that pulses with life. His story is not merely history, it is a call, an invitation, a promise, that from the simplest beginnings, from the humblest hearts, from the most unlikely places, brilliance can arise. That truth, pursued with honesty and wonder, can illuminate the world. That the next Faraday may already be among us, waiting for a spark. Faraday's legacy is not a closed book, but an open page, waiting for new hands to write the next chapter. When we close the book on Michael Faraday's life, it is tempting to see it as a completed story, a humble boy who rose to greatness, who transformed science, who left the world brighter than he found it. And yet, to view his life as finished would be to miss the deeper lesson. For Faraday himself would never have spoken of endings. To him, science was an endless horizon. Each discovery only opened new questions, each answer pointed to mysteries yet unknown. Faraday once said, "Nothing is too wonderful to be true if it be consistent with the laws of nature." This single sentence captures the essence of his legacy. He believed that no matter how astonishing, no matter how impossible something might seem, if it aligned with nature's laws, then it was real and it could be found. That belief is what carried him from a bookbinder's apprentice to one of the greatest scientists in history. Today, the world he helped create surrounds us. The lights above our heads, the hum of machines, the invisible signals carrying voices and data across oceans, all of it traces back to Faraday's coils, magnets, and wires. Every flick of a switch is a whisper of gratitude to the man who revealed the forces that power our age. But his greatest gift was not electricity or magnetism. His true gift was the example of a life lived in pursuit of knowledge, guided by humility, fueled by curiosity, and shared with generosity. Faraday showed that science was not the privilege of the few, but the inheritance of all humanity. He proved that one person, armed with persistence and imagination, could change the world. And so the story ends, but only as a doorway to the future. Somewhere in a modest home or a crowded city, another young mind is reading, questioning, and imagining. Perhaps they too feel the spark of wonder, the pull of curiosity. Perhaps they too will dare to take a step into the unknown. The torch Faraday carried has not gone out. It burns in the laboratories of today, in the classrooms of tomorrow, and in the quiet moments when someone looks at the stars or at a flicker of light and asks, why? Michael Faraday's life was a testament to the truth that knowledge is boundless, that discovery is endless, and that the smallest spark of curiosity can ignite a fire bright enough to illuminate all of humanity. And with that spark, the story continues into your hands, into your questions, into the future yet to be written.